Hi guys, okay, I'm going to try this out in the smoking pit, so hopefully the sound is going to be okay. As I said, I just wanted to just slow down and give these last slides their proper due. So the point was, the failure of the Wilsonian vision, the League of Nations, to prevent what it was designed to prevent, World War II, from happening, left the world in ashes again, and that was indeed, Phoenix-like, a moment to remake the world. But, the interesting thing is long before actually the war was decided, in 1941, where it was not at all clear Germany wasn't going to win the war, the Atlantic Charter was agreed to. And it's the Atlantic Charter, you'll note, that does not contain Stalin here. This is a meeting between the British and the Americans. And they advance in the Atlantic Charter a vision for the world that they are fighting for, they say, right? And they commit that they will, upon winning this conflict, seek no aggrandizement. They will not gain territory, as is generally the point of war. And, that any change, pardon me, in territories shall be based on the will of the people involved. So we are hearing the full-fledged articulation of the principle of national self-determination. All peoples have such a right, they argue in the Atlantic Charter. Well, not all people actually, is important to note. They use the expression, those nations demonstrating adequate national maturity, meaning that some colonies, like Britain's, for example, will need to remain colonies until such time has been reached that self-governance will be appropriate. It's going to happen faster than they care for. But they too, like Wilsonians before them, commit themselves to a post-war environment in which they will try to reduce or remove barriers to trade, to seek an institutional environment in which global economic cooperation is possible, and the pursuit, as I was saying in class, of social welfare. Right? From the FDR perspective, he was insistent on inserting the language from his fireside chats during the Great Depression of the right of all people to be free from want and fear. The British are going to win the war, of course, or the Allies will win the war, and the first thing the British are going to do is throw the war hero Winston Churchill out of power and put Labour in office. And Labour wins on a campaign of winning the peace, meaning now that we've gone through this great sacrifice, let's build a Britain worthy of the sacrifices we've made. And the Labour anthem will become New Jerusalem, and the welfare state and its flagship National Health Service are the products of that. Right? And of course, more liberalism, freedom of the high seas to assure trade and that sort of thing. And then there's also already talk of reducing the armaments of the world to the lowest possible level, to only that which is required for cooperative security, defense through cooperative security. Okay? The UN is envisioned, as I was saying quickly, as like the principal legitimating actor in international politics. You will study in my foreign policy class, or you will hear in other areas, this very important document in American Security Council history. NSC 68 is the document that is fairly described as that which militarizes American foreign policy, commits it to a never-ending, or for however long it takes, struggle against communism. NSC 68 is one of the most profoundly transformative documents ever issued by the American National Security Council. It changed the course of American foreign policy from the Truman administration forward in terms of committing the U.S. to global leadership in the anti-communist struggle. But even it said that there was a very important role for the United Nations, much strengthened. Right? And so I gave you the Barnett piece to review the kind of situation as it was in the 1990s, and we saw, or in his view, we see evidence throughout the world of the United Nations as being a critical element of the liberal world order. And that's despite the, as I keep saying, when we focus on the politics of the Security Council and things like that, we tend to see its glaring weaknesses, right? But when we look beyond that, the United Nations becomes far more important than certainly realists can understand, and many Americans who hate the UN can appreciate. Right? The world obtains its order. The liberal international economic order is ordered by more forces than simply economics or collective, security through force. Okay? It is ordered by ideas, by values, and the identities of the states that emerge in a commitment to those principles. Right? So, of course, he's a constructivist, right? He believes in the power of ideas in the construction of our political environment, our political reality. Okay? And the United Nations, Barnett is clear about, right, can play a very important role in the normative, integrative integration, right? The kind of bringing together the disparate elements of international society into a more cohesive society through collective adherence to critical virtues and norms, right? And this is all despite, he says, the obvious problems with the liberal order not aiding weaker states as much as it does the powerful ones, right? So the UN is a critical element of this liberal international order that I've been kind of setting out the institutional landscape for you, right? So from the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, in just a moment, right? The United Nations is critical. The idea of human rights is a linchpin of the new order, right? The idea that, and this is liberal in its kind of ideological origin, the very idea of a universal declaration of human rights gives, an emphasis to the importance of individuals in the political cosmology of international affairs. It is not an arena only of states. Okay? And you'll hear me say in international law or in discussions of international legal affairs that, in my view, the most important development in international law of the last 40 or 50 years is the emergence of individual human beings as rights-bearing subjects under international law. And human rights law has been central to that. Okay? Now, indeed, the Security Council is the principal actor or agent of collective security of this environment. Right? And the 5 permanent members makes it an outdated institution in that sense, and there's great need for reform of it. It is a non-universal institution. But the fact that there are 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent rotating members means that the other 10 do get a voice. So there is at any time 10 non-permanent members, and the presidency of the council rotates on a monthly basis through including those 10. So it is an important forum. It is often bogged down in politics between the great powers and mutual vetoing. But it is not the completely dysfunctional wreck that some would have us believe. Now, what I want us to spend a few minutes finally on is the idea of... So, I don't know if I'm stepping over it. I'm going to be pissed off. So what is hegemony, right? A hegemon is the kind of undisputed power that sets the terms, the rules of a system, and enforces the rules of those systems, and in fact often excuses itself from the rules. It sounds monstrous in many ways, and I've come a long way kicking and screaming from my days as a graduate student when I had to read books on hegemonic stability theory, and I used to draw little swastikas in the margins because it all struck me as fascist ontology, and what we need in the world is order, and it was just, I just hated it. But I have the data is pretty hard to argue with sometimes. So a hegemon is essentially the state at any one time that exercises apparent preeminent power. And it is generally, the data is pretty strong on this, associated with periods of relative peace in the international order. So we talk about periods of Pax Britannia, two centuries, two individual centuries in which it was the undisputed leader. These were relatively peaceful periods, all the way back through, the hegemony of the Dutch, and all the way back to Portugal in the 15th century. So the idea here is that the U.S. is, now, and has been since the articulation of the liberal order, the world's hegemon. So what does it do? What does a hegemon do? Well, in kind of conceptual, theoretical, political, sciencey sort of terms, we talk about the role of a hegemon as being responsible for providing public goods. Now, what's a public good? Okay. In political sciencey terms, or economics terms, a public good is that which has certain qualities to it that make it hard to get delivered. Market economies are not very good and usually fail to deliver public goods. But public goods are important. Publics want them, but their nature makes them hard for markets to provide. Kind of the easiest example is something like a lighthouse on a coastline. Okay? Now, a lighthouse has a service. It's a good, and it's a value to shipping lines. Right? The light projects from a dangerous area and keeps ships from wrecking on the shore. That lighthouse is of intrinsic value, of great value to those who utilize its services. It's a public good in the sense that once it's constructed, anybody can have its services. Anybody can utilize the services of a lighthouse. You can't somehow direct the light in the direction of those ships that belong to shipping lines that helped pay for the construction of that lighthouse. Those shipping lines that gave nothing profit just as much from the functioning lighthouse as those who helped pay to build it. That's in the essence of public goods. They're non-divisible. You can't deny them to certain users. Right? So the nature of public goods themselves, indivisibility or non-deniability, means they're hard to deliver because we all have an incentive to not contribute to their production. We all have an incentive to free ride. Let somebody else pay for it, because once it's built, I'm going to profit anyway. Right? If we see that as a collective action problem and understand that international society has or faces hosts of public goods provision problems or collective action problems, then we start to see the function of a hegemon. The hegemon can act in ways that make sure public goods get provided. It sacrifices often, right, to have these done, but it sacrifices in its own interest because, yes, it may pay for something. The U.S. has paid for European defense at a level that has Donald Trump in, fits. The bottom line is that America helped pay for European defense because European defense served American defense. Right? I think Americans would have rather the war with Russia start in Europe than in the United States. Right? A lot of obvious stuff seems to be missed on Trump's part. Right? So it is said that hegemons establish the rules and institutions and norms of an order, right, and has the power to enforce them. Right? So in the area of security, the U.S. established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, forged alliances throughout the world, critical Asian alliances. Right? In the economy, it established what was called the Bretton Woods system, grounded in certain institutions that we've already talked about, but I'm just going to give you a quick refresher. Right? The Bretton Woods institutions were formulated at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for the purpose of, coming up with a way to stabilize the international economy. And central to the Bretton Woods system that lasted officially from the end of the war through the Nixon administration, 1971, was that all the currencies fluctuated, but their value was tied to the value of the US dollar. So it became a dollar economy. One of the signs and instruments of US hegemony is the fact that it became the global economy, became a dollarized economy. Right? So we have the British pound, the value of the British pound, pegged to the value of the US dollar. So when the US dollar appreciates, so does the pound. When the US dollar depreciates, so does the pound. And the German mark, the French franc, and so on. Right? The US dollar itself was pegged to a set price of gold at $35 an ounce. Right? So that one could always have the promise of handing in dollars for gold at a rate of $35 US dollars per ounce. Right? That was the basis for the dollarized economy. And it functioned this way, and it stabilized currency rates and currency exchanges, and thus avoided currency crises in these countries until things in the 1970s got a little rough, and Richard Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Many states still kept their currency tied to the value of the dollar, and many still do today, but the dollar itself was no longer pegged to the price of gold. We got off the gold standard and let, according to, since Nixon, the value of the U.S. dollar be determined in currency exchange markets. Okay, but you can see the centrality of the U.S., the hegemony of the U.S. in an international financial system in which the U.S. dollar pegged to the gold and all these other currencies pegged to the value of that dollar. Right? That's U.S. leadership. Right? What are the characteristics? Well, we pursued and enforced the rules of an open multilateral trade system. Right? Now, we tried to organize an international trade organization right after the war, but that was scrapped. And what was then possible in its place was this long, slow, arduous process of a series of agreements, first bilateral and then increasingly multilateral, trade negotiations called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And each round increased the number of states involved and the issues at stake. I have to go catch the bus, so I'm going to pause this. Okay, so we go to the GATT route. So as I said, we had an international trade organization planned at the Bretton Woods conference, but it never quite makes it off the ground. And largely scrapped by the Republican U.S. Senate. So what takes place in its stead is, as I described, a slow, long, arduous process of, at first, meetings at which pairs of states, bilateral meetings, two countries meeting at a time, working out bilateral, one against one, trade agreements that reduced, at the first round, Geneva in 1947, $10 billion worth of tariffs. So we had at the first kind of replacement meeting of what would have been the International Trade Organization that was envisioned at the Bretton Woods Conference to be the third leg of the Bretton Woods system, IMF, World Bank being the other two. So we'd have the finance, currency stuff managed by the IMF. We'd have development and reconstruction financing available from the World Bank, and then we'd have trade issues managed by the International Trade Organization. But instead of having an ITO, we have to build into eventually the World Trade Organization the ITO bit by bit. And it took place in a series of rounds called GATT rounds, whereby, as I said, each pair of countries worked out with the other partner how much they could agree to sorry, I did send a text message. And there were 23 countries participating in that first round. So we had some 50 or 60 pairs or bilateral agreements that were negotiated successfully at the Geneva round. So what we get at the start in 47 are 23 member states who agree to cut tariffs between them. Okay, so sorry, I had to do that. So the just kind of briefly go through what the GATT accomplished, and really the whole World Trade Organization is built on the agreements hammered out at the various GATT rounds. So the major proportion of the rules and regulations that govern world trade at the World Trade Organization are the rules established and agreed to at the various GATT rounds, from Geneva to the last one, the Doha round. So it began as I'm trying to think now where I left off, but it started in Geneva in 47 with just 23 countries, but really the whole kind of free trade commitment owes itself to those 23 countries. And these 23 countries accounted for about 80% of all world trade. So it was quite a significant accomplishment. But remember what I said is that it wasn't a multilateral, meaning it wasn't an agreement between 23 countries. It was dozens of bilateral agreements between two countries each, agreeing to reduce tariffs between them. And in terms of American leadership, which had called for this round and called for the initiation of GATT, it sort of set the pace by itself reducing voluntarily its tariffs by 35% across the board. So that first round alone is said to be valued at $10 billion in savings in terms of reduced tariffs. And then we had a kind of a stall in the GATT growth, in the GATT history. We had a series of subsequent rounds that actually first dipped in the number of countries participating and then started to grow again. But it was still all about tariffs, basically, right? Now, presumably you know what a tariff is, but in case you don't, I mean, a tariff is really been the primary obstacle to freer trade in a world economy. A tariff is simply a tax that a state imposes on goods or services that are imported into that country. Take, for example, tariffs that still exist. Let's think. Korea. Well, interestingly, they had to get rid of the tariffs, but for a long time, Korea, Japan actually still tariffs American beef. What purpose do tariffs serve? Well, they're, in one sense, an opportunity for states to draw revenue, but the real purpose of a tariff is to prop up, support, defend, protect one's home industries, indigenous industries. And that's particularly important. And one of the most important criticisms of GATT, World Trade Organization, free trade commitments, and the importance of not having tariffs comes from developing countries. The reason this is
a very important criticism. Pardon me. Let me get a drink of water. Okay. The criticism coming from developing societies, developing countries, is that they need tariffs to protect the industries they are trying to just get off the ground. That's the very essence of development. It is in a state's interest to, this is not an age of mercantilism, but if one can produce its own automobiles, the country's better off by doing so to the best that it can, in economic terms, to the maximum extent to which it has some kind of comparative advantage in doing so. Because then it doesn't have to pay and exit its own money, its own currency, in the purchase of foreign auto imports. So in the 1970s, actually, in the terms of development field, the kind of buzzword became indigenous development, or how to build your own domestic diversified economy, and yet manage to survive the competition with existing, more mature companies. Think about, say, a country like Thailand or Senegal. Similarly situated economically speaking, Thailand's a bit better off than Senegal. But if Senegal wanted to quit relying on French auto imports, or American for that matter, and build its own automobiles, it has no history and has no industry that builds automobiles at present. So think of all that has to go in to building automobiles from scratch. A lot of investment, massive amounts of capital, right? Presuming you get all that problem worked out, you still have the unavoidable experiential problem. You've never made cars before. So you're probably not going to be as efficient, nor as good, but certainly not as efficient, at making cars as they are in Germany or the United States or Japan, where they've been making cars for a very long time. That means that the cars or trucks that Senegal starts to make are not going to be as good nor as efficiently manufactured, meaning they're going to be more expensive. So they're both more expensive and not as good as what you can buy in an import. Now, if you're a Senegalese, consumer, what's your choice going to be? As a rational, unless you're a super duper Senegalese nationalist, you're going to buy the cheaper, better import, aren't you? Of course you are. So what do states do in such a situation? They have traditionally relied on tariffs to make those imported automobiles so expensive as to make the domestically produced automobile more attractive. And that allows what are called nascent, newborn, new industries the time that they need to work out the kinks of the production process and get to a level of efficiency, and that they can then compete on an international scale. The unfairness of GATT and the WTO, from a historical perspective, is that while the liberal international economic order and the interest in trade in particular after World War II was reasonable given the shambles that the world economy was once again finding itself in. And given that there were very clear economic causes of both World War I and World War II, it was reasonable to prioritize free trade and try to start reducing tariffs and promoting the freer exchange of goods and services across borders. There's nothing in that that's nefarious. But historically speaking, it's unfair to developing societies because the United States became the industrial powerhouse of the world because it used tariffs to protect its new industries when they were new industries until such a time that they became efficient producers of whatever it is that they produced, auto manufacturers, whatever, that they didn't need the protection of a tariff anymore. They could now fairly and successfully compete on a global market. So by 1947, when they met at Geneva, it's fair to say that, the advanced industrialized countries had mature manufacturing processes in place. But developing countries enter into this equation, enter into the World Trade Organization, have to accept the basic proscription on tariffs, which in a way makes it perhaps impossible for developing countries to develop their own indigenous manufacturing capabilities because they never get that period of protection from a tariff that would allow their indigenous industries to get off the ground. You can see that the criticism is reasonable. You can, I think, hopefully see that the reason GATT was instituted was reasonable, but historically unfair to developing countries today. So it's no surprise that the first 5-6 rounds really focused on getting more and more tariffs down. But it was kind of a boring and stalling period in GATT history. Not until the mid-60s, with the Kennedy round, did we see the move out of simply a focus on tariffs. There are other things that get in the way of trade. There are other obstacles that prevent a freer flow of goods and services across borders, besides tariffs. And by the time the Kennedy round, and certainly by the time the WTO is established, tariffs are, in many respects, greatly reduced. Then they start focusing on other ways in which states prevent free trade. And in the Kennedy round, they focused on the problem or process of dumping. What is dumping? A state dumps into somebody else's economy when it sells a product, a commodity, a good, a service, at a price greatly lower than they would normally sell it for in their own economy, in their own market. For example, if corn in the United States grown in the Midwest, Iowa and Indiana, sells for, $2 a pound, but they sell it in West Africa for 75 cents a pound, something's fishy, isn't it? Why is it selling for $1.25? What did I say, $2 a pound? So why, if it's selling for 75 cents in West Africa, are they selling their corn at a greatly reduced price from what it sells at home? Well, it's an unfair trade practice. They're trying to drive out of business West African corn farmers because West African corn farmers cannot compete with goods, commodities sold at a price that that the market wouldn't bear back in the United States. So usually dumping happens when the government is involved. What would normally happen here is that corn farmers in the United States aren't just taking a hit by selling it at 75 cents a pound in West Africa. They're usually almost certainly getting subsidies from their governments to make up that difference. So they're getting what they need. And then the West African corn farmers are being forced out of business by this dumping. So dumping was then taken on in the 60s. And and they advanced a set of rules for how to respond to dumping, and investigations. allowing the attachment of a tariff, basically, if it's proved that dumping is happening. Then we move into the Tokyo round, the kind of second half to the end of the 70s, and we move into additional non-tariff measures. As we move from Tokyo into Uruguay, we start dealing with what are called TRIPS and TRIMS. TRIMS, trade-related investment measures, TRIMs, or TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property measures, are dealt with as we get into the Uruguay and Doha rounds. And these are, especially the TRIPS, the intellectual property, these are controversial and problematic in my view. Basically, what I think is reasonable to say is, with respect to TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Scheme, basically what you had was the U.S. system of intellectual property law kind of forced onto the world trade system. Now, what this means is intellectual property is important to protect, right? Musicians, artists, firms that spent a lot of time and money and research and development in a new product, has a right to, have its intellectual property rights protected. But this also includes pharmaceuticals. And the TRIPS elements of the free trade regime run smack up against the human right to medicines necessary to save one's life from, say, HIV. One of the lowest moments of American foreign policy history, and there have been a lot of low moments at times, was during the Clinton administration, actually. It was during that time that TRIPS were becoming really quite critical issues, the trade-related intellectual property. And it was also the time when the AIDS pandemic was really heating up, taking off, particularly in Africa. And it was none other than Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore, who defended American pharmaceutical companies' rights to not have the poorest countries in the world manufacture their own generic AIDS retrovirals because of the intellectual property rights attached. And so we had a situation in which this otherwise progressive Al Gore, Saved Planet Earth and all that, arguing that Africans basically had to die if they could not afford to pay the price of the antiretrovirals they needed to save their life from HIV, as produced by Western pharmaceutical companies. And there are lots of reasons why that's just immoral, crappy behavior. It also doesn't respect the fact, and American pharmaceutical companies don't respect this fact, that a great deal of the research that goes into a product that eventually comes out of a pharmaceutical company is actually research done in universities, federally funded by tax dollars. That never seems to make it onto the negotiating table for some reason. So at any rate, as we move to the end, we've gone from a kind of a focus on tariffs and the establishment of something I should have mentioned earlier, the establishment of kind of like the golden rule of trade, which is most favored nation. The central principle of global trade regime is non-discrimination. The basic idea is that when you're engaging in free trade, you treat all your trading partners the same. They all get the same deal. They all get treated as if they are your favored nation. Right? So the most favored nation status is that which is accorded to all the members today of the World Trade Organization. If you are a member of the World Trade Organization, you enjoy most favored nation status with all other members of the WTO. That means you cannot be discriminated against. unless you do something like dumping and can be retaliated against. Right? So the principles of most favored nation, non-discrimination, developed over time. GATT eventually creates for itself the institutional structure of the World Trade Organization. And it is, as I said, the structure of the kind of structure originally envisioned as the International Trade Organization, but it rests on all those rounds of negotiations and laws and treaties of trade that GATT produced. I would just point out kind of some of the critical elements here. What makes the World Trade Organization important? I would point out, right, is its capacity for dispute resolution. Right? So we have in the upper right blue box, right, the General Council, sorry, I can barely read that, seated as a dispute settlement body. Right? And then we have an appellate body, that green box on the right, that hears appeals from the dispute settlement body. The reason the dispute settlement body is so critical, it is the essence of what makes the World Trade Organization important, significant in international affairs, is countries, states take each other's trade disputes to the WTO. And it is the dispute settlement body and the appellate body that really kind of has to accept the results of the dispute settlement body unless there is a consensus at the WTO that the dispute settlement body got it wrong. And the decisions are binding. So examples, George Bush, the second one, instituted, like Trump does, tariffs for political purposes. He instituted some steel tariffs against Ukraine, I think in Japan perhaps, in order to curry favor with the auto manufacturing industry, because it made it, in the steel industry, of course, because it made, it cheaper to use U.S. produced steel. We were brought before the dispute settlement body at the World Trade Organization, found to be in violation of the rules of free trade, and we had to take that tariff off. George Bush had to, backtrack. A rather more nefarious one, kind of dealing with non-tariff barriers to trade. The United States started marking tuna, canned tuna, as dolphin safe many years ago. The problem is that many forms of tuna fishing are still rather primitive and catch lots and lots of tuna that just simply die in the net, and dolphins that die in the net. So American kind of environmentalists instituted this practice of designating those canneries that had caught tuna in dolphin-safe ways, and then they got a marking, and people that cared about that stuff, it usually meant it was a little more expensive, but they could make that choice. Actually, the U.S. was brought before the World Trade Organization by Mexico, I believe, and a couple of others, who argued that they did not have the economic development that would make engaging in that kind of fishing possible. And thus, the marking at home was a kind of non-tariff barrier to trade. It was an unfair practice disadvantaging poorer countries that could not employ those, and we lost the U.S. lost that case. Perhaps a little less controversial and easier to see. France, in around 2009, was trying to prevent or trying to promote the domestic production and sale of French-made lawnmowers. So French people would buy not John Deere imported from the U.S., but French-made by Peugeot. I don't know who would make them, but now they couldn't put a tariff on U.S. That would obviously be a deal buster. What the French government did was require John Deere tractors and lawnmowers, and only John Deere, to come with skirts around the lawnmower, ostensibly for environmental reasons. But it was clear that it was just marking these as the American products that they were. And the U.S. appropriately took France before the WTO and won. Clearly, that was a non-tariff barrier violation of free trade. So again, just finally, a bit on U.S. leadership. It has been said that, American hegemony has been essential. What have been its characteristics? What has the U.S. done? Right? Well, it has been responsible for what's called the embedded liberalism of the international order. That's what embedded liberalism means. It's not an obvious term. It's not a term that explains itself very well. But liberalism, hopefully now, makes sense, right? And it's a term that Americans find very confusing because we use it in American politics in the very opposite way that it gets used everywhere else in the world. Liberalism of the liberal international economic order is the kind of liberal capitalism, limited government, free trade, all that kind of stuff, right? The embedded part of embedded liberalism is like socialism, right? Embedded liberalism refers to like a little bit of socialism in a liberal order, meaning welfare states for the most part. Right? The U.S. leadership, by, for example, forking out the billions of dollars that it spends on defense in Europe, meant that European countries were freed up with enough money to build these more expansive, more extensive welfare states than even the U.S. could afford for itself. So what we have is a system of global liberalism, but inside many of those states is an embedded socialism. Right? I would argue, as others have, that embedded liberalism is what gave the liberal international economic order its vitality. It's what lifted many working class people in America and in Europe out of the working class and into the middle class. Right? We had a kind of engine of growth coming internationally from all the liberalism of the world order, and then an embedded socialism domestically that was aiding people to, kind of become who they could be at the domestic front. So we have free trade, but managed domestic economies, in other words, right? We have these permanent international institutions that the U.S. has helped establish and the U.S. helps fund. I mean, the U.S. pays 20% of the World Bank's fund. Of course, it gets 20% of the vote at the World Bank. So, it's not altruistic. It's hegemony. It's serving it. And this is what the Trumps seem to miss. They seem to see only that we pay more than Europe does in NATO, and not how much NATO has served American interests. Right? So the creation of these permanent international institutions, and really quite clearly noting that there's always been a special relationship, one might say a security community, a special emphasis on the relations among Western liberal democracies as the kind of core of the liberal international economic order. So what I would just finally conclude with is the U.S. has, over time, acted hegemonically in a number of ways. I mentioned that at the first GATT round, it voluntarily set the benchmark of 35% reductions in tariffs. Other things that it's done, as I've mentioned, is spending the money that it has for the defense of Europe, but doing so frees up Europe to create these impressive welfare states that improve the quality of their lives, giving the whole order a legitimacy that serves everyone's interests. Of course, it was the United States that bankrolled Reconstruction after World War II. It was only the U.S. that had the money to rebuild Europe. And so the Marshall Fund, the Marshall Plan, sending, by today's dollars, trillions of dollars into the destroyed European economies to get them back on their feet so that they could then become again engines of growth of their own. And today the U.S. Contributes a great deal of money for, through the World Bank for development in the developing world. I may not be a great fan of George Bush, but he instituted what is clearly seen as a godsend by those fighting AIDS on the ground in places like Africa. The President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, was an unprecedented amount of money spent by any country to fight an infectious disease, and Bush got it right. And so we might talk more later. U.S. leadership in this hegemonic way has also meant that it's allowed others to cheat and get away with it, because that is often what hegemons do, actually. We say that hegemons are defined by those who have the power and the resources to make and enforce the rules of a system. But they also allow others to free ride because it may be in the interest of the order to let them. So things like, how long will we let China or developing societies generally pollute at higher levels than advanced industrialized countries before they too have to start reducing their carbon footprint? That's the sort of sacrifice that hegemons make, A, because they can afford to, and B, because if they don't, the system itself may collapse. We may get no carbon footprint reduction from anybody. So a big part of U.S. hegemonic leadership has been allowing cheaters, free riders in the language of the theories of collective action. So it's spent a lot of money. It's spent a lot of money on military. It's not got the kind of welfare state that one enjoys in Europe. Because of that, it's allowed others to kind of cheat us in our own games of trade and things like that. But we do so because it's better to sometimes let them free ride for a while rather than bring the whole system down by too harsh a treatment of free riders. That's been the nature of U.S. hegemonic leadership with respect to the liberal international economic order. We have more to say. Next week, we start talking about what's been sowing the seeds of this crisis that it's in. Okay? Hope that was helpful. Cheers.